This channel is only possible thanks to direct contributions from viewers like Kronos, Karazin Magi, Argus, Milk, Bleed Red, Aria Reed, Christopher Welch, Jacob Sandoval, and you. If you'd like to contribute to making more videos like this possible, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on Patreon, or by buying a t-shirt at the merch store. Thanks a bunch, and I hope you enjoy the show. Hey gamers, Taz here, and today we're going to talk about the light aspect and its relationship to Vriska and Terezi, whose relationship Andrew describes in page 211 of Homestuck Book 4's author commentary as the arguable axis around which the whole epic revolves, when you really study all the ramifications from the fallout ensuing from their rivalry, ensuing revenge cycle, and mutually floundering struggle for redemption, in the warped way each of them defines that idea. On page 153 of the same book, he says the moment you stop writing about Vriska by herself and start writing about Vriska and Terezi, the avenues of analysis seem endless. It's a circuitous, psychologically tortured mutual arc which on closer inspection serves as the axis around which literally the entire plot revolves. He says this by way of explaining that in Homestuck, key relationship pairs can bring a lot out of certain character readings, which lines up well with my own reasons for wanting to explore these characters in pairings, specifically the romantic pairings we've been doing so far. Although Andrew also mentions Dave and Dirk, Nepeta and Equius, and Arquius and Dave Peta in this bit of commentary. But even in that context, Vriska and Terezi are singled out as a pairing with unique importance over the plot. Those are very strong statements to make about any characters in a story with a cast as big as this one, and I would almost be inclined to disagree, if not for the fact that I think that thematically, Vriska and Terezi's relationship serves like a complement to Rose and Kanaya's relationship, answering a complementary question. I mentioned in the Rosemary video that Rose's arc as a light player generally seems to revolve around the question of whether or not the world, existence itself, is inherently worthwhile. Basically with whether the world is good or evil at the root of it, whether living is a blessing or a curse. By the end of the comic, Rose largely seems to conclude that the world is good, thanks largely to her relationships with Kanaya and Roxy. Vriska's path as a hero of light is similar, in that it's also motivated by a deeply philosophical question. In Vriska's case, this question is whether or not people are inherently good or evil. Whether we mortals are fundamentally sympathetic yet flawed creatures who struggle but have the potential to rise beyond the circumstances that define us, or whether we are in most regards little monsters simply playing lip service to the idea of being kind or even civilized, and deserving only of judgment and suffering at the hands of whatever forces conspire to create us. This question is central to Vriska's character in both a metatextual sense and in universe. Metatextually because, frankly, the entire fandom was animated by discussions about whether or not Vriska was irredeemably evil, a victim of her circumstances, or some combination of both. An ever-raging debate we both continue to engage in and perpetually remember as the Vriscourse. It's important in universe because it also happens to be a question that both Vriska and Terezi are absolutely obsessed with. Especially, as we're going to see, the versions of Vriska that act very intensely like they're actually completely certain that they're doing the right thing and that they are inherently worthwhile. In S. Terezi Remember, Terezi and Vriska do conclude, like Rose, that both of them are inherently worthwhile and good people, worthy of each other's respect and affection if nothing else. But to understand why it matters that they reach that conclusion, we need to understand the mental and emotional roadblocks that got in their way before they could do so. So let's take a look at their childhood through the particular lens of Terezi's perspective. Terezi's a fascinating character when it comes to analyzing Vriska, because her role in the story is more or less to contain within herself the two intense poles that define the fandom's perspective on Vriska. By the time we're introduced to their relationship in Hivebent, Terezi already harbors the opinion that Vriska is basically irredeemable, and openly holds her in intense contempt. But despite herself, she also can't help feeling some deep affection for Vriska, hoping that somehow Vriska will turn around and give her some leeway, some word or deed that will somehow convince Terezi that Vriska has truly changed for the better, even though Terezi herself can't figure out what such an action could possibly look like. This is because Terezi understands Vriska better than anyone, and despite being too inexperienced to truly understand what she was seeing at a mere 13, already had some inklings of the bigger forces shaping Vriska's behavior and responses to the world. As such, part of her hates Vriska for her outrageously cruel actions, and part of her deeply feels for Vriska, empathizing empathizing with her as a fellow survivor of the deeply screwed up world that made both of them who they are. So what is it exactly that Terezi is seeing? Well, there's the original sin that both brings Vriska and Terezi together in the first place and begins to drive them apart, which is Vriska feeding potentially thousands of people to Spider-Mom through Florp. At first, Terezi eagerly participates in helping Vriska feed her mother, and she does seem to understand that it is necessary for Vriska to do this if she wants to survive, since if she doesn't, Spider-Mom will just eat her instead. Terezi does take issue with the fact that Vriska just feeds Spider-Mom everybody, in her own words, as opposed to just the people that Terezi, as a young teenager, thinks are bad enough people to deserve to be murdered. A pretty extreme and childish version of right and wrong, if you ask me, especially when you consider that, according to supplementary media, Spider-Mom is ravenous, and unlikely to care much about how morally objectionable her food is, not to mention extremely demanding and cruel to Vriska. I realize I'm being kind of speculatory in a way that gives Vriska a lot of moral leeway here, but that's because this particular period of time is important mostly because it implicates Terezi in both direct moral wrongdoing herself and in being very judgmentally harsh and potentially even cruel to Vriska. I'm not actually interested in the question of whether or not Terezi's being unfair though. What I am interested in is the fact that Terezi herself probably looked back on this period of time with a strong sense of regret. Hold on to that. Then there's Vriska's abuse and paralysis of Tavros, murder of Aradia, and blinding of Terezi. Terezi doesn't mind the blinding, but like much of the fandom, rightfully finds Vriska's treatment of Tavros and Aradia completely unacceptable, and pretty much ends her friendship with Vriska on the spot, writing her off as a lost cause up until she kills her at the end of Act 5. Ultimately not to punish Vriska for killing Tavros, or because Vriska was the out-of-control mass murderer that Terezi made her out to be for a bit there, but simply to preserve the Alpha timeline and stop the rest of her friends from being doomed by Vriska's actions. This leaves Terezi with a gaping hole in her life and a psychological conundrum. Her happiest memories of her childhood in Alternia were with Vriska, and yet, in the end, she was forced to conclude, in a permanent way, that Vriska was simply unsalvageable, unfit to be part of the living world with the rest of her friends. But she can't ever fully erase the part of her that loves and misses Vriska, and worse than that, she knows that she herself isn't that different from her. Vriska killed thousands of people, but so did she. Vriska was uniquely awful to Tavros, but given Terezi's role-playing identity of Neophyte Redglare, she was clearly somewhat familiar with Mindfang's journal, and must have understood that Vriska was, on some level, trying to emulate her ancestor. Terezi has a good understanding of doing terrible things in pursuit of a role model, since it was in the guise of the Legislacerator that she justified her murders as not just necessary, but morally justifiable. But there was one piece of the puzzle of Vriska that Terezi did not yet fully understand or have personal experience with, and that was Vriska's abuse, corruption, and exploitation at the hands of a man who was well connected to the levers of power in Alternian society and the universe itself. By this I mean Doc Scratch, of course, who is, by all accounts, an adult in Vriska's life, who takes an almost parental role in guiding both her and the people around her, even as he uses them like tools to achieve his ends. It's true that Terezi, Kanaya, and Aradia all have some minor exposure to Doc Scratch, but he has an unusually intense relationship with Vriska early on in her life, to the point that they semi-regularly play games together, offering plenty of time for Doc Scratch to groom Vriska into being in whatever mindset he needed her to be in order to eventually play out the plot as we saw in Homestuck. We can never have a full picture of what that manipulation looks like, but we do know that he's directly responsible for influencing Vriska into killing Tavros and Aradia, something she expresses regret about and says she originally never intended to do, having considered them off-limits. Vriska is still responsible for her actions, of course, but it is worth noting that she is at this point a 13-year-old girl who wouldn't have taken those actions if it wasn't for some millions-year-old man essentially strong-arming her into it. Remember that Doc Scratch carries the will of Lord English with him, and Lord English is Caliborn, who early in his artistic career explicitly targets Vriska with extremely vicious, murderous art mocking her for the idea that she could be relevant. Doc Scratch is still motivated by Caliborn's hatred of women, and belief that they are inherently worthless and unlikable, as reflections of his sister Calliope. This is all particularly vicious because it means that Vriska grew up in a world built and defined by these two men, a world where who gets to be relevant and important is defined by who's willing to be the most bloodthirsty and callous. And she grows up internalizing those ideologies and doing her best to live by them, trying her best to be important and relevant through the standards set by Caliborn, even while the forces that set those standards in her world openly mock her for it behind her back and to her face, while having the power to basically shape everything about her life right up until the moment of her death in Act 5, which is orchestrated by Gamzee. who exploits Terezi's confusion and anger about Vriska to use her as the murder weapon. Soon after which, Gamzee gets into an almost 3-year-long relationship with Terezi, likely while under orders from Doc Scratch and under the influence of Lil Cal, again making him an extension of the influence of Doc Scratch and Caliborn. And remember that besides Vriska, the other characters that Caliborn explicitly singles out for violence and marginalization are Nepeta, who Gamzee kills himself, and Terezi, who Gamzee eventually beats almost to death at the conclusion of this relationship. So it's not a coincidence at all that Gamzee degrades and abuses Terezi, making her feel less than and worthless throughout their time together, exacerbating her feelings of self-loathing, self-doubt, and confusion in the absence of Vriska, totally neutering her influence for most of Act 6. But in her dying moments, Terezi's able to turn things around with the retcon. Contrary to what seems like popular opinion in some circles, Terezi doesn't bring Vriska back to act as a deus ex machina and single-handedly save the whole timeline. Instead, she tells John that she's expressly motivated simply by a desire to fix her own mistakes, not feeling confident enough to judge anyone else's. She views having killed Vriska as being a mistake, and so she brings Vriska back. This has a few beneficial knock-on effects. Namely, Vriska and Terezi between the two of them are able to effectively neutralize Gamzee, diminishing Lord English's influence over the journey, and Vriska's more confrontational nature prompts Kanaya and Rose to work together on dealing with Rose's alcoholism sooner than last time. Vriska does not solve Rose's alcoholism. Rose primarily credits Kanaya with helping her through that. From there, this version of Vriska basically goes about clearing up the loose ends of the plot that nobody else cares about, primarily concerning Lord English. Terezi helps out to some extent and makes some progress towards figuring out what her feelings for Vriska actually are, confessing those feelings to Vriska in a heartfelt message. But this version of Vriska is in no state to properly accept or respond to those feelings. These versions of Terezi and Vriska end the story somewhat emotionally unfulfilled, even if they have the future potential to eventually meet up and embrace their feelings for each other. Emotional relief and clarity comes instead to the versions of Vriska and Terezi that died through the various manipulations of Gamzee and Doc Scratch. The version of Vriska killed by Terezi goes through a whole arc in the afterlife where she faces her own mistakes in the form of her ancestor, Arania, and then slowly grows to reject Caliborn and her own ideology of might makes right and survival of the fittest, by just kind of living and growing closer to Mina Pixies until she's abandoned by her. The final conversation between Vriska and Vriska is immensely illuminating as to where both versions of her end up. Vriska is a version of herself that can actually be happy and vulnerable with the people around her, one that has separated herself from the ideology that made her need to feel important, relevant, and meaningful to reality at large, specifically through feats of heroism and valor, the ideology that she inherited from Caliborn. Alpha Vriska, on the other hand, still feels the need to live up to those standards, and resents the idea that she could be worthwhile as a person without doing so. This colors her entire campaign in pursuit of the treasure and Lord English as a somewhat suicidal attempt at self-redemption for her past crimes. It's essentially her repeating the mistake she made with Beck Nor, in that she seemed to believe that the only way to redeem herself and be considered a good and worthwhile person was to put a stop to an omnipotent force that was threatening everyone she cared about, either Beck Nor or Lord English. Her conviction in this regard might have been cosmologically necessary for the Alpha timeline, but it is still kind of tragic, especially in the last case, when it was clear that all Alpha Terezi really wanted was to have her friend back. This is what Game Over Terezi and Vriska discover together, that ultimately it didn't really matter whether either of them was accepted within the world at large, as long as they could accept and embrace each other. Vriska might have committed many horrible wrongs, but at the end of the day, she didn't need to win over everybody in Paradox Space, or prove herself as objectively worthwhile to the invisible eyes of history or the audience. She only really wanted or needed understanding and love from her friends, specifically in this case, Terezi, and vice versa. That is the light that the two of them get to hold on to, for however long they continue to exist inside the dream bubbles. And as for whether or not these particular versions of the two survive past this flash, well, that's for the realm of fanfiction to preside over, where all things are possible, simultaneously. Wow, this video really got away from me, and I didn't even include everything I wanted to. Oh well, I hope you guys enjoyed the ride, and until next time, keep rising. Huge thanks go out to my patrons for making this video possible. If you want to help support the channel and come join us at our awesome and growing Discord community, feel free to join us for as little as $1 a month. You can also find me on the r/Hiveswap Reddit and Discord. That's all for now, so thank you again, and as always, keep rising.